Hi, everyone. Welcome to Happy to See Me, the podcast that puts the spotlight on the overlooked and underestimated. I'm Erika Casupanan, and this week I am speaking with Latoya Nugent of the organization Rainbow Railroad. But first, I love to start each episode talking about something I was happy to see this week. And right now, as we're recording, it is early in Pride Month, so this episode is going to come out later in Pride Month. And I've had the chance to do some keynote speaking around my queerness. So for folks who don't know, I also work as a keynote speaker. I love being on stage and sharing inspirational speeches. And I've been invited to talk about my queerness. And this was not something that I was necessarily out pitching myself for. I still feel nervous about sharing such a personal story. Listeners to the podcast know that there are certain details about my life I will talk about. There are certain details that I tend to keep to myself. When I was invited to speak about my queerness, I was nervous because I thought, is my experience enough? I still feel that queer imposter syndrome. And if people aren't aware of queer imposter syndrome, the way that I describe it is the feeling of not being queer enough. So it can be for many reasons. It could be for feeling like you haven't had enough queer experiences, or you haven't been out long enough, or you don't look queer enough, or you don't do quote unquote queer things or queer activities. For whatever reason, it's that feeling where you don't feel queer enough. And when I was invited to speak at these events, these organizers were saying that I could just speak about my life authentically. So I did it. I got on stage and I also mentioned the queer imposter syndrome. And if anyone has felt queer imposter syndrome, by the way, on episode 60, I do a deep dive into my queer imposter syndrome. So check that out. After doing these speeches, I got so many kind messages from people saying that they resonated with what I was saying when it came to queer imposter syndrome in particular. So it was so nice to know that what I was saying was so validating to people. And at the same time, all of those kind messages I received were so validating to me. So truly, thank you to anyone who invited me to speak, who listened to me speak, who wrote to me. And even if you're listening to this podcast and anything I've ever said about my queerness at 34 has resonated with you. And what I was happy to see was this feeling of community that came from talking about something that I thought I was the only one experiencing. I also want to acknowledge that getting on stage and talking about queer imposter syndrome, or even podcasting about queer imposter syndrome, is a privilege. And in this episode, which is a very special one, we are shedding the light on issues that queer people are facing around the world. In this episode, I am speaking with Latoya Nugent, who is the head of engagement at Rainbow Railroad. Rainbow Railroad is a global not-for-profit organization that helps at-risk LGBTQI plus people get to safety worldwide. And the organization helps LGBTQ plus individuals access lives free from persecution. Latoya Nugent is a Black, queer, feminist activist. And in this interview, Latoya talks about what Rainbow Railroad does, why LGBTQI plus people are still facing persecution around the world, and why we need to care this Pride Month and beyond. Plus, Latoya herself used Rainbow Railroad services to relocate from her home country of Jamaica to Canada. I want to warn everyone that there are mentions of violence in this episode. This is also one of the most important episodes I've recorded. I teared up many times in this interview. So if you tune in and find this episode meaningful, share it with somebody. I learned a lot in this episode, so let's get into it. Here is my interview with Latoya Nugent of Rainbow Railroad. I hope you enjoy it. Now, you are part of an organization that I think is so important to so many queer Canadians, which is Rainbow Railroad. So can you please explain what Rainbow Railroad is?
Rainbow Railroad is a global charitable organization that works to support LGBTQI plus people who are at risk because of their LGBTQI plus identity. In over 60 countries across the world, LGBTQI plus people who have been criminalized because of their sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, or sex characteristics. And what happens in these countries is that many queer and trans people experience violence, persecution, and different forms of discrimination. And so it places them at risk, and they often reach out to Rainbow Railroad to provide in-country support or support with relocation based on their circumstances. We've been around since 2006 when we were just a volunteer run organization. Now we have a staff and internship complement of about 65 people located in the US, Canada, and in a few other countries across the world. And we've expanded our programs that have enabled us to provide support to about 15,000 people since our founding in 2006. We saw last year, for example, a record number of what we call requests for help. These are the individuals who are overseas requesting support from the organization because they're experiencing discrimination and other forms of violence. It's difficult work, it's painful work, and we wish there wasn't a need for it. But the reality is the need exists, and we try to stand in the gap for individuals who are looking to find safer places that they can call home and places where they can feel like they belong and affirm their queer identity.
Yes, the need certainly exists. And I think that as a queer person living in Canada, you always hear about how we are lucky to live in this country and that queer people are facing persecution in other countries. And I hope that you can help us to better understand what is going on. So can you explain why are queer people still facing this type of persecution abroad?
A lot of reasons. The number one reason is that many countries still criminalize same-sex intimacy between consenting adults. Some countries have really extreme forms of punishment in the form of the death penalty or life imprisonment. Beyond that, even in countries where LGBTQI plus people are not criminalized, the cultural attitudes of people in the society is one of rejection. There is little to no acceptance of queer and trans people, and this often results in homelessness, community rejection. Many people often commit suicide or attempt to commit suicide. There have also been instances where people have lost their jobs because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation. We've also seen the rise of the anti-gender movement globally and the exportation of anti-LGBTQI plus hate. And this is usually because of the work that's been done by evangelicals. Interestingly enough, in North America, they are exporting this hate. And what happens is it creates an environment of rejection, hate, and just overall negative attitudes towards the LGBTQI plus community. And it affects LGBTQI plus youth disproportionately, many of whom are made homeless by their own parents, their own family members. There's a lot of bullying that people also experience in schools, including universities. That degree of persecution or the extent of that persecution lends itself to people reaching out to us for support. We've had individuals who've been victims of things like conversion therapy. For example, many lesbians and bisexual women who reach out to us, they have been victims of homophobic rape because sometimes their own family members try to correct, quote unquote, correct their sexual orientation by arranging for them to experience rape. And this is something that it uniquely affects a lot of women who are in the 18 to 25-year-old category, because in a lot of these countries, there's a perception that you're supposed to be straight or you're supposed to be heterosexual. And it's really heartbreaking for me because I am aware of quite a few circumstances or situations where women's own parents, including mothers, have been perpetrators of this by getting adult men to force themselves onto young lesbian-identified women in a bid to quote unquote correct their sexual orientation. It's a painful series of circumstances that affect LGBTQI plus people. In some instances, the persecution is state-sponsored, and there's a lot of crackdowns that take place in countries like Uganda or Afghanistan, for example. In many instances, we've seen where LGBTQI plus identified human rights defenders have been thrown in jail. They've been arrested for doing the work that they're doing with and for the LGBTQI plus community. And this often results in them reaching out to Rainbow Railroad for support with their work, because a lot of times they want to continue to do the work, while in other cases, people may be forced to flee. And we also step in those circumstances.
It's so heartbreaking that so many of these circumstances are still happening. There's no doubt that there's the need to support so many of these queer people who are abroad. For queer people who are abroad who require relocation, what normally causes this to happen? Are there certain catalysts? Are there certain events in their life that happen in order for them to need to be relocated?
It varies. Usually, when people experience extreme forms of violence, that's usually one of the number one drivers for people who believe they have no other way to survive except to leave. Because what will happen is, before someone gets to the point of actually relocating for different countries, oftentimes they try to relocate within the same country, trying to see if they can find refuge. But in many instances, they're not able to find that safety and refuge that they're looking for. And so the only option that's left for them is to actually flee home and cross international borders. But that is a very difficult journey. Sometimes it takes years for refugees who flee home. In some instances as well, in order for them to access resettlement pathway so that they can permanently relocate to a country like Canada, they have to spend months or years in what is called a transit country. And this is usually a country that is close to their own home country or in the same region or a neighboring region, where they remain for a while until their asylum case is processed and fully adjudicated, and then they're allowed to relocate. Sometimes while people are waiting, they also experience forms of homophobia, transphobia, and discrimination and violence. It's a very complicated and long process that folks have to go through in order to actually relocate. Other individuals may pursue making asylum claims at borders like the Canadian border or the US border. But we've seen, I'm sure you've seen the news reports where many governments are trying to take away the right of individuals to make asylum claims. And so they are restricting access at their borders for people who are fleeing home, seeking refuge in countries like Canada and the US. But if you can imagine what it's like to live in a country where you don't have full rights as a citizen of that country, you have little to no support from your family, little to no support from the community. You don't have access to affirming healthcare. You are sometimes chased in the streets by community members trying to harm you. To live your life through that for months, years, decades even, there is a point at which you break. And so a lot of folks, when they reach out to us, it's usually because they are at that breaking point. They have nowhere else to go. They don't know what else to do. It is nearly impossible for them to survive or even to thrive in their home country. And so in order for them to escape the site of trauma, to escape all of the mental health challenges that they've experienced, to escape all of the violence, to escape the possibility of arrest and so on, they make the difficult decision to leave the place that they would have called home for a very long time.
It's disappointing. There's so much grief that must come with that process, where they know that it's best for them to leave, but then it's still leaving the place that they've known their whole life and the place where all the people they know are. And it's heartbreaking that this type of work has to exist. At the same time, it's so important that it exists. Can you talk a little bit more about the types of services that Rainbow Railroad offers to queer people who are facing persecution?
Yeah, so we offer quite a few programs and services to individuals. We have what's called our emergency travel support program. And this is where we assist individuals in relocating to countries where they will make an asylum claim in that country. We also have our government pathways. So these are programs that are sponsored by the government in partnership with organizations like Rainbow Railroad, and oftentimes with the support of the community to support or assist a refugee after they have relocated to a country like Canada or the US. In these cases, though, the individuals are processed overseas. And that processing can sometimes take a very long time. So earlier when I mentioned that sometimes people have to spend months or years living in a transit country, it is because they are awaiting decisions about their asylum claims. Because the reality is that refugee systems are really ultimately set up to control immigration. There's a lot of criteria that people have to meet in order to be eligible for the programs that are available through these government partnerships. And that's part of why it takes so long. There's a lot of processing, reams of paperwork that they have to complete sometimes to quote unquote prove that they experience persecution as a result of their sexual orientation and gender identity. We also provide information services and referrals because, as you imagine, we don't have the capacity to facilitate the relocation of every single person who sends a request for help to us. What we try to do is to establish as many partnerships as possible with organizations overseas doing work to support LGBTQI plus people so that we can connect individuals to the resources that may be available to them on the ground in those countries. We have a partnership portfolio as well where we provide funding and other technical support to grassroots organizations in some of these over 60 countries that criminalize LGBTQI plus people. And we do this because while we are supporting individuals with relocation, we recognize that what we really want is for everyone to be free to live with the dignity that they deserve in countries that recognize their full humanity and rights as LGBTQI plus people. And there are many human rights organizations and human rights defenders in a lot of these countries that criminalize LGBTQI plus people who are doing the hard, difficult, and complex work of culture change and legislative change in their own countries. And so we partner with a lot of these organizations in order to contribute to their efforts to achieve the change that we all are working collectively towards. We also offer support to individuals who, having relocated, may also experience challenges with navigating their new home country. And so we have volunteers on the ground in places like Canada or in the US who work with the refugees after they relocate to help them to acclimatize to their new communities, to understand the financial system, to secure housing, which we know is very difficult to secure in places like Canada, through this kind of community support or what we call communities of care. The expectation is that refugees will have an easier landing after relocate because everything doesn't change after an individual relocates. There's still a lot that they have to work through, especially in those first few months, because like a significant majority of the individuals who we support with relocation, they are usually relocating alone. So they don't have family or friends, that community of support that they can rely on unless we step in and provide that for them, or at least connect them with the individuals who are willing to provide support to refugees after they relocate. The other program I also want to mention is our crisis response program. So, as there are many crises that affect LGBTQI plus people globally, the most recent ones that we've been working on since 2023 have been the passing of the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda, for example, that resulted in a lot of government crackdowns and really caused a crisis for the LGBTQI plus community in Uganda. We've seen in Russia, for example, where the LGBTQI plus movement has been labeled as a terrorist organization. And the implications of that, we've seen it, especially for human rights defenders doing queer advocacy and queer liberation work in Russia. We also see what's happening in Ukraine. So as crises occur that uniquely and disproportionately affect LGBTQI plus people, we have a program specifically designed to step in those emergency situations to provide crisis response support. And we usually do that with our partners on the ground, because we are in the global north. We don't want to impose on folks in these countries, because they know what's in their best interest. They know the tactics that will work. And so what we do is play a partnership and facilitative role in those circumstances where there is a crisis and we need to act.
It's incredible that there are so many of those services offered, because truly support is needed throughout the process, and it doesn't end once somebody reaches a new home country. Right now, for anyone listening, as we're recording this, it is the beginning of Pride Month. So it is Pride Month. It's normally a really celebratory time for the LGBTQI plus community. Why is it important for us to care about LGBTQI plus refugees who are around the world?
Erika, while we can be here in a place like Canada and celebrate what it means to be queer and trans, the reality is, if the over 15,000 people who reached out to us for help last year attempted to do that in an open, public, affirming way, it could cost them their lives. Mm-hmm. And that is something that we have, as people who have the privilege to celebrate our identity, it is something that I think we have to sit with and realize that we can do more to support our queer siblings or family members overseas. I say family members because they are family. We are all family. If we are blind to what's happening globally, it means that change will not occur and people's lives will continue to be at risk. And so I think it is important for us to be in the know, to stay in the know about what is happening globally with queer and trans people, and to make intentional decisions about how we can support or ways that we can assist individuals. I know that we will not be able to touch every life, or we will not be able to assist everyone, but it is important, I believe, for us to know what's happening and to work with organizations like Rainbow Railroad to take action and to support organizations that continue to do the difficult work of making change to ensure that across the world, LGBTQI plus people are free to affirm their identity, to celebrate who they are, and to live in countries where their rights are respected. Canada, the US, many countries in Europe that are affirming LGBTQI plus people now, they weren't always there. Like 5-10 years ago, there were more countries that were criminalizing LGBTQI plus people. So we know that change is possible. And a lot of the change that we've witnessed over the years has been because of the work that organizations like Rainbow Railroad continue to do in partnership with the organizations in these countries. And so now just over 60 countries criminalize LGBTQI plus people in one way or the other. But that number is actually going down because people in the North, people in other parts of the world are attuned to what is happening and are taking meaningful action, whether by supporting legislative work or supporting the advocacy organizations and the human rights defenders doing the work to make this change possible.
It's so true. Change is possible anywhere. And if there's this type of persecution happening somewhere, that means that it's possible anywhere. So it's important for us to be aware. Something that I read in the Rainbow Railroad annual report that really surprised me was how much closer to home this is getting. So in the report, the top 10 countries with requests for help are listed. And one of the top countries was actually the US. So why are there more people asking for help out of the US at this time?
To the point you made earlier about if it's happening somewhere, it can happen everywhere. And we're seeing that in the US. We've seen with Roe v. Wade and just the rise in the anti-gender movement and the strength of the evangelical movement in the US and the kind of influence that they have over law and policy and culture, that you're seeing in more and more states that LGBTQI plus people's lives are at risk because of the anti-gender, anti-trans type of legislation that's been passed at the state level. And so it's a tension for us at the organization because the United States remains one of the top countries where LGBTQI plus refugees from all over the world would like to relocate to. At the same time, we're seeing the rise in the anti-gender movement in the US that is resulting in the displacement of trans people. We're seeing in many states where individuals are reaching out to Rainbow Railroad because they live in a state that has anti-trans legislation and they're trying to get to states that are more affirming, or they're trying to get to Canada because they see Canada as a more affirming country. But one of the things that we've also recognized, though, is there is an antidote within the US for that. It makes me think about the origins of Rainbow Railroad. Our name, we got it from the Underground Railroad that in the 19th century was helping to facilitate the relocation of Black people from the southern parts of America to travel up north. And so within the US at the time, there were places where it was safe for you to be Black. And similarly now, in some parts of the US, it is safe for you to be LGBTQI plus identified. But in some parts of the US, it's not safe for you to be queer and trans identified. And so we have a program called the Communities of Care program that is in the US where queer, trans people, allies of the LGBTQI plus community come together to provide support for LGBTQI plus people fleeing home and relocating to the US. So it's really an interesting dynamic that we're witnessing. But one of the most hopeful things about the US right now is how we're seeing these individuals rallying around and supporting their queer siblings who are relocating to the US, needing to find that sense of home and belonging that they're looking for. Just yesterday, there was Pride celebrated in DC, and we recently facilitated the relocation of a few refugees to DC, and they were participating in their first Pride celebration ever. They were filled with so much emotion, and just seeing all of the color and feeling the warmth of queer people and just being comfortable in the queerness of their skin and being celebrated for who they are. So while that is happening in the US, we're also seeing in the US that in other states, the legislators are trying to roll back a lot of the progress that we have witnessed in the US over the years. It's a very interesting and difficult tension that we have to hold in this work, but the reality is that there's still a strong community in many cities across the US where we can find support in our allies and in the LGBTQI plus community. And we are also still seeing that refugees all over the world are saying that the US is a place that they want to relocate to.
What a complicated dynamic. And I think it also shows in places where people have believed that they were safe for a time, in those same places, people can also then not feel safe. And I think
Absolutely.
that a queer life is as valuable, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in the US, whether it's Canada, because if someone is suffering, that means anybody is vulnerable to
Yeah.
suffer. And for the listeners, I think up until this point, they are not aware that you actually are now the head of engagement at Rainbow Railroad. And you have also used Rainbow Railroad services yourself. So can you share a bit about your story of how you used Rainbow Railroad when you relocated from your home country?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting story for me because I was familiar with the work of Rainbow Railroad, not as intimately as I am now, of course, but I was familiar with the work of Rainbow Railroad several years ago because I worked with organizations in the Caribbean that was doing some of the grassroots work that I mentioned earlier. But we recognized that there are some people who had to flee. So I lived in Jamaica. There are a lot of people in Jamaica who identify as queer, and when their identity became public, it placed them at risk, and so they were forced to leave. One of the ways that we supported their relocation was to provide what's called a letter of support to describe the reality in the country and to sometimes speak to the unique experiences of the individuals who were looking for support with relocation. So at that high level, I was familiar with what Rainbow Railroad did and that folks in danger were able to access the resources of the organization to help with relocation. But it wasn't until 2022 that I decided that perhaps it was time for me to make the move and to flee Jamaica because I recognized by then, this was maybe about 4 or so years after I was arrested for doing the kind of advocacy that I did in Jamaica and across the Caribbean. And after that arrest, it took me a while, perhaps months, to recognize the degree of harm that it caused. I sat with it for years. I became a recluse, let's put it that way. I stopped working. I became very depressed. I wasn't engaging with my family as much. Like it was a very violent arrest, the way the police came after me, the way they treated me when I was in lockup, the way they threatened to physically harm me. I remember the night because I spent one night in jail. And I remember when I was waiting to be thrown into the jail cell, like listening to the police officers at the time scheming about how they would ensure that that night harm would come to me. And I just recall repeatedly saying to myself that I would not sleep that night because I didn't know what those threats meant. I didn't know if I just didn't know exactly what would happen to me. I mean, at some point I fell asleep and I was told that I woke up the next morning in shock. And so there's a lot about it that I don't remember. But the thing that really struck me was just how hard I tried not to sleep that night because I didn't know what was going to happen to me in that jail cell. And so because there was so much violence around the arrest, my time in the jail cell, I think even though I tried to get back up and to do the work and to be bold and brave and resilient and all of these words, it became too much. It really took a toll on me. And so I decided that I would leave the work completely. I stopped doing advocacy. I stopped working. And I think what happened in that period, like in the months and years that followed, was all of the homophobia that I would have experienced over the years that I had suppressed because I was seen as a leader in the community and a sort of inspiration for others. It all came back up and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to handle it. And it really affected my mental and emotional well-being for a very long time. And so it wasn't until late 2022 when I attended this conference in Barbados that hosted for queer women across the Caribbean region. And I was listening in on a panel discussion where Rainbow Railroad had a representative. It was around immigration and relocation and seeking asylum. And there was an individual who worked at the organization at the time who had also fled Jamaica to Canada. And in talking about the work of Rainbow Railroad, they also talked about their own experience with homophobia and being forced to flee Jamaica because of that. And it actually brought me to tears. And I remember walking out of the room, hiding my tears because I didn't want anyone to see the impact that the panel discussion had on me. And it's almost as if in that moment, I recognized that the only way for me to live again, the only way for me to survive and to thrive was to leave the site of trauma that was Jamaica, because it really did a lot of harm to me. I also believe that I harmed myself by staying there for as long as I did, because it really is not a kind place, a healthy place, or a safe place for you to be an LGBTQI plus person. And so I reached out to the organization after that conference. I explained what was happening to me, what I had gone through. I was also experiencing a lot of judicial harassment. And they came through for me. The organization came through for me. I relocated here in November of 2022. And I mean, I'm 42 years old now. And this is the single most important decision that I've ever made in my entire life. I have seen the transformative impact of that one decision on my life today. Like, I can call Toronto home now. I feel safe. I feel loved. I feel affirmed. I feel like I belong somewhere. And I feel like I can make significant contributions to my community again, something that I couldn't do for a while because of just how violent that arrest was and the impact it had on me. And I was able to get the support that I needed, and because of that support, it helped me to realize, in looking back at my journey in Jamaica, just how harmful that place is. But that as an activist, when you're in the work, doing the work, you try to be optimistic. You try not to see the harm that the work is doing to you or the harm that the society is doing to your community, because you're hopeful and you're thinking that this is home. This is the place I call home. I have nowhere else to be. But once you leave that site of trauma and you get to live among people who love you for who you are, affirm your identity, and you are able to live in a country that respects the fullness of your humanity and protects your rights as a human being, as an LGBTQ plus person, it's almost as if you're living in an entirely different universe. I don't know if I can fully articulate the difference or that kind of transformation, but it really feels like an entirely different universe that you get to experience. And it doesn't mean that everything is perfect here in Canada. Of course, we have our challenges. The way that I am able to live and walk in my truth and affirm who I am every day and contribute my skills and my talent to this work and to my community, there's no world where that would have been possible if there wasn't an organization like Rainbow Railroad. And I remain forever grateful to this organization for having the vision to do this kind of work, so that it can lift people like me up and help us to find hope and home again.
I'm sorry that you experienced that type of violence in your home country. To have the place that you grew up be the site for you to experience that violence, it probably felt like such a betrayal, and I'm so sorry. And you are someone in your home country, you were educated, you were accomplished, you were a leader, and you used the services of a not-for-profit organization to help you. Was Rainbow Railroad the only option for you, or was it simply the best option for you?
For me, it was the only and therefore the best, because there's a uniqueness about the work that Rainbow Railroad does. Even though there are organizations across the globe doing refugee resettlement work more broadly, responding to the global forced displacement crisis. Right now, over 114 million people have been displaced. This is based on data from the UNHCR. They're actors in the space trying to assist people who are fleeing home because of war, climate disasters, and other forms of drivers of displacement. But there aren't enough organizations like Rainbow Railroad that is intentional about its support for queer people who are forced to flee home because of persecution and violence. So there really aren't many options. Even though there may be other organizations doing related work, they are not doing it on the scale that Rainbow Railroad is doing it. And so for a lot of people like me, it really is the only and best option to be able to leave the site of trauma and flee home so that we can relocate to places like Canada.
For people who are in Canada or are in the US, how can they support Rainbow Railroad during Pride Month and throughout the year?
We have a massive campaign happening now. We call it Solidarity in Pride, and that's very dear to my heart because to the points we made earlier around being able to celebrate Pride here, in a lot of countries, people are not able to do that. And so our Solidarity in Pride campaign is attempting to raise $2 million by June 30th of this year. And you can visit our website, you can donate, you can also join the fundraising fund, create a donation page or a fundraising team, get your family members, your friends, your colleagues involved to spread the word about the work that Rainbow Railroad is doing, how important it is, the fact that we're one of very few actors in the space supporting our queer family abroad. That's a massive campaign happening now that we really would want people to support. All the information is available on our website at rainbowrailroad.org. Folks can also sign up to volunteer. I mentioned our Communities of Care program earlier, and we also have a similar program in Canada. So the Communities of Care program is in the US. We have a similar program in Canada where people can volunteer to be refugee sponsors. And what that really means is that after people relocate, you help them to settle in. You help them for a few months in the US or in the case of Canada, up to a year, so that they can acclimatize and actually find that home and belonging that they're in search for. Follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, X/Twitter, LinkedIn. So you can learn more about what the organization has been up to. We have a partnership with Refugee Housing Canada for folks who are in the GTA and they have a spare bedroom or an apartment that they want to rent to refugees at below market rate. They can get involved and support that way as well. We also encourage people as much as possible, contact your elected officials and let them know what is happening with LGBTQI plus people abroad so that they can pressure the government to create more dedicated pathways and programs to help at-risk LGBTQI plus people. Because a lot of people sometimes take very dangerous pathways to try to get to Canada or the US. But if the government has the safer pathways, then we can facilitate the relocation of more queer and trans refugees. And we really want people to invest in more sustained partnerships with the LGBTQI plus community and civil society so that we can work more collectively to increase the protection and safeguarding of the rights of LGBTQI plus people who are experiencing forced displacement abroad. And anywhere, whether it's in your home, in your workplace, or in the community, speak up and speak out against homophobia and transphobia. And donate. Don't forget to donate.
Wow, you have opened my eyes to so many things. I feel like there's so many more questions I could ask you about Rainbow Railroad and your incredible journeys. If anyone is listening and they're interested in learning more, make sure you check out Rainbow Railroad's website or social media so you can learn more about the organization and even read more about Latoya's story. I want to ask you one more question before we wrap up. Since it's Pride Month, what does Pride Month mean to you? Or do you have a message for everybody this Pride Month?
Oh, I have lots of messages. I could talk about home and belonging all day. The word home has never meant so much to me as it has since relocating here. Because, and it's something that I feel even more, like I'm more acutely aware of it during Pride, because there's something in the air. I can't quite explain it, but there is something in the air during Pride Month where everybody comes alive. It's more colorful. You feel the solidarity. You really feel like you belong. So Pride for me is about home and belongingness. I feel that way throughout the year, but it's like it's 10 times that feeling during Pride Month. And it makes me realize that that is the thing that many queer people who have experienced forced displacement are looking for, to feel home and to feel like you belong. Because when you walk through the world with that sense of belongingness, you feel like you can do anything. Like there's nothing that feels impossible to you. There's nothing you feel like you can't do. There's just a different way that you show up in life. There's just a different way that you walk through the world, and you walk with confidence and a hopefulness. And hope is so important, because when you're living in places where you have to suffer, like it's hope that carries you. And so I just feel all of that more intensely during Pride Month. And it's something that I want every single queer person to feel wherever they are in the world. And I will continue to do this work until that happens.
What a beautiful way to end it off. I feel like I'm going to cry. Latoya, thank you for the work you do to give everyone that feeling of home. And thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Erika.
And happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
I will definitely share links to Rainbow Railroad's resources in the show notes. And if you know someone who's interested in learning more about Rainbow Railroad and Latoya's story, make sure you share this episode with them. This episode is a special one because this is actually the season finale of season 2 of Happy to See Me. Can you believe we are wrapping up season 2? When this season first started, it was back in September, and now there have been 38 episodes in season 2. Wow. Thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in throughout the season. And I promise you, the podcast will be back. I'm going to take the summer to do some traveling. I'm going to work on some other creative projects. And of course, I'm going to be brainstorming to get ready for season 3. So in the meantime, I'm going to be re-releasing some of my favorite episodes from season 1 in the podcast feed. So make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcasts so you can check those out. And Happy to See Me season 3 will be back in the fall. And in the meantime, if you have any ideas, let me know. You can send me a DM on Instagram, or better yet, you can send a DM to the podcast Instagram, which is @HappyToSeeMePod, and I would love your guest suggestions. And make sure you follow along on YouTube. It's @HappyToSeeMePod on YouTube. All of the video interviews are available there. I cannot believe that there are now 64 episodes of this podcast available to everybody to enjoy. Having a podcast is something that I had been thinking about for years. And thanks to all of you who have been tuning in, I've been able to make that dream come true. And you really have no idea how much your feedback and your guest suggestions have meant to me. You have no idea how much having this podcast has changed my life for the better. So I want to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in over the last 64 episodes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I hope everybody enjoys the summer, and I will be happy to see you when we're back for season 3.